Hey everyone at home, this is Sweet Ruka, I'm Kate, and this is
Curtis.
Alright, and today we're going to talk about catamarans.
Specifically, we want to debunk the top 7 myths about sailing catamarans offshore. Since we've sailed around Cape Horn in both a monohull and a catamaran, almost back to back, we think we're in a good position to give you guys some real feedback and our real experiences about how it was to sail around in extreme conditions on both of those vessels.
Alright, let's get to number 1 right away, shall we?
Let's do it.
Let's do it.
Okay, number 1. We are going to debunk the myth that catamarans are faster than monohulls. It's a big sales pitch that's always put out there in all the marketing materials. You go to the boat shows, the guy's going to tell you that you should get a catamaran. They're better for cruising because they perform better than monohulls. And that, by default, is something we completely disagree with, and we think that we've proved 100% false, and we'll show you right now. Okay, so here are both Sweet Ruka and the catamaran Artemis sailing in very similar wind conditions, very similar wave angles, both with conservative sail selection, and both of those boats are doing very close to similar speeds in the same conditions. So that right there, I think, is visual proof you guys can see on the Speedo that a performance cruising catamaran and a performance cruising monohull can actually be sailed to very similar speeds. Okay, so to wrap this myth up that catamarans are faster than monohulls, really high performance catamarans are extremely fast. When you get up into the high level of full carbon daggerboard catamarans, even some of the boats now are coming out with seafoils. Those things are incredibly fast, but they are not by any means cruising catamarans. They're almost boats that need to be sailed and cared for by professional sailors. They're racing machines. At the other end of the spectrum, we've got your charter and very cruising oriented catamarans, something like a Gemini or a Lagoon. Those are going to be slow catamarans. No, hands down, you're in the range of something like a full keeled heavy steel monohull in that realm. And really, we feel like our boat, the Sweet Ruka, the J-boat, and Artemis, the DazCat, I think those really fit pretty squarely in the middle and are comparable on a mono to a cat based on speed in the performance cruising realm with your cruising amenities, but also wanting to sail a little bit faster. And in that realm, we don't think a catamaran is really by default any faster than monohull.
Yeah.
Okay, shall we move on to myth number 2 about catamarans?
Let's do it. Alright, so myth number 2 is that catamarans are more fun to sail on than monohulls. And we had a great time on Artemis. I will say we had a blast. There were definitely some highlights, but in general, overall, I gotta say that when I have the wheel in my hand and we're just surfing out on the perfect wave or going so fast, like you could see in Cape Horn when we hit 15.4 knots, I just felt this great feeling of sailing. You just feel the boat, like you're almost one with the boat, almost, not to sound too corny, but in general, I would say, it's a personal preference thing, but I think if you really enjoy sailing and the feeling of the boat and feeling the boat load up, then sailing a monohull could be, and for me, is more fun than sailing a catamaran.
Yeah, I think that catamarans win hands down. They are more fun at anchor all the time.
Yes.
But when you're out sailing, catamaran is much more sailing by the instruments instead of sailing by feel.
Yeah.
So the catamaran's not going to heel over. It's not going to, you're not going to feel the acceleration as much, and you're going to have to make sailing decisions based more around your instruments, not the feel of the tiller or wheel in your hand or the wind on your face. And me too, I guess this is where Sweet Ruka wins, I think, is in the pure fun to sail side of things, I enjoy sailing our boat.
Yeah.
It's fun. I can sail it all day long. Versus on Artemis, it was sailing,
Yeah.
but it was a different kind of sailing
Yeah.
where you didn't get wet. You didn't have the wind in your hair. And in some ways and places, that actually has its benefits.
Yeah, I would say in our particular conditions, it was quite cold where we were sailing and at this time of year. And so when we were sailing Sweet Ruka, we were outside in the elements, and it was fun, but it was only sustainable for so long, really, because we're getting cold to the bone. And in Artemis, we were, toasty warm pretty much the whole time, except for when we went outside to film.
Which kind of brings us into our next topic here, which has to do with being inside while you're sailing and what the boat feels like. So our third myth that we need to bust here is about the dreaded bridge deck slapping of a catamaran. I think when I was looking to buy a boat, I was tossing up catamarans versus monohulls. And that was something that I read all the time about was, you're gonna get lots of slapping. The sound is terrible. It reverberates through the whole boat. You can't sleep. They're terrible offshore.
Ruins the whole experience.
Yeah, because when you get into waves, if you have a catamaran with a somewhat low bridge deck, it's just going to slam and slam and slam. And Kate, what do you think? What was your experience while sailing inside Artemis in similar conditions in big waves to the experience being inside the boat in Sweet Ruka?
Well, I would say specifically this experience, there was, and Artemis has a pretty low bridge deck.
As far as catamarans are concerned, like compared to like a gunboat or a katana with a high bridge deck, but there are also catamarans, that are out there with lower bridge decks. Just to be clear, it's kind of, maybe in the middle ground.
A sort of flat level surface, and so, there were times we were sailing in pretty flat water, and there was no sound, just the whooshing of the waves going through. And the same thing happens with Sweet Ruka. When we're sailing in flat water, sailing downwind with very few waves, it's calm and peaceful. When we're sailing upwind or big choppy waves, there's gonna be banging, there's gonna be loud noises. So when we were sailing on Artemis, there was definitely some slapping noises. But when we were sailing on Sweet Ruka, which I can show you here in the video, you're going to hear lots of loud banging, slamming noises as well. It was a little bit bigger conditions, but still, when it's big conditions, you're going to have noise. I didn't think it particularly ruined the experience. It wasn't so disturbing. I was able to sleep through it inside a hull as well. So it really was not this sort of deal-breaking thing that made me go, oh, I could never sail or live in a catamaran because of this bridge slapping.
I agree 100%. Definitely not a deal breaker for me, and I think that it's a myth.
Yeah, so myth number 3, bridge decks and bridge deck slapping, not a deal breaker for buying a catamaran. Let's see what the next one is. Okay,
so the next myth that we want to tackle is that catamarans are better for people that are susceptible to seasickness than monohulls. And I'm going to let Kate take this one away because she is the one that is maybe a little more susceptible.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I do tend to be a little bit more sensitive to the conditions than Curtis seems to be. To try to give you a quick summary, I do get sick on the monohull, particularly in big waves, big conditions, and at night. I sort of got a system down now that I try to avoid seasickness, but it still does happen. And on the catamaran, I was really hoping that with being able to look out at the horizon and be completely surrounded by windows as we're sailing, that would maybe solve my equilibrium problems and really, in the big waves and conditions, I would just feel, maybe not so big of movements. And so that was really curious and interesting for me. Unfortunately, we didn't put this in the video. I did get quite seasick after we rounded Cape Horn, and we started hobble horsing a lot, which was a new motion for me.
Hobby horsing.
That's what I said.
I said hobble horsing.
Oh, okay, sorry. So when the boat started hobble horsing.
Hobby.
Okay. The boat started hobby horsing. as we went around Cape Horn, and it was quite uncomfortable, and I actually got quite seasick. And the really negative part about that for me was when I start to feel really seasick on the monohull, I can sort of go outside, reorient myself, and reset. But on the catamaran, I couldn't find any place to reorient myself. I was already looking at the horizon and trying to balance myself, and regardless if I went outside or not, it didn't matter. There was no sort of reprieve for me to sort of try to combat the equilibrium problems I was feeling. So the only way I could do that was to try to nap, or I had already taken my seasickness meds that seemed to have no effect on what I was experiencing. So unfortunately, the fact that we think a catamaran is more stable and more flat sailing is not actually the case. We at times even had stuff flying all around. A drawer that wasn't pushed in came flying out. Didn't catch it on film, but yeah, it's
things came off of the counter, things came off of the table, just like they do on a monohull. When you got into the larger waves, there was significant motion inside the catamaran. It wasn't necessarily side to side as much. It was more fore to aft.
Yeah, and just some sort of awkward motions in general that you can't always predict as you're moving throughout the boat. So myth number 4 is that the boat motion and seasickness is better, and I gotta say that is false.
Busted.
Busted. That's not necessarily the case, and maybe for some people it is, but for me it definitely was not.
All right, let's move on to myth number 5.
Myth number 5 is it's just a floating caravan. Well, Tom and Hannah are able to shorthand this boat probably long distances because of the comfort that they experience inside of the cabin house.
Catamarans are drier and more comfortable to sail in extreme conditions. I think that we should just drop the video in here and show you guys side by side comparable conditions in the catamaran and the monohull. Yeah, let's do it. Send it. So as you guys can see, I was outside with goggles on, getting blasted in the face with wind and waves, versus Tom is driving Artemis from inside the heated cabin, looking out the window, blocking the wind and the waves, blocking the waves that spray up on his windshield with a windshield wiper. Completely different experiences, and I have to tell you that is, I think, one of the places where Artemis really won out, hands down, over the Sweet Ruka, was comfort and warmth while actually sailing. So on Sweet Ruka, you need to go outside to adjust the sails. You need to put foul weather gear on. You're going to get wet. On Artemis, there was no requirement to go outside. Most everything could be done from inside or from within the protection of the cabin house in the aft of the boat. So in cold weather conditions, in times where you're fatigued, I think that the catamaran in this point totally wins out.
Yeah, I think at times, a lot of times we have the autopilot dialed in and we can come inside for warmth, but sometimes we're hand steering, as you saw Curtis doing as on our return trip back from Cape Horn. So that was something that would definitely wear us out over time if we had to keep going much longer distance in those cold conditions.
Well, and I noticed a comment in our last video. Someone said, "Oh, well, you're basically just driving a caravan around Cape Horn." Well, and when you're cruising and you're sailing for very long distances, when you're crossing oceans and you're going for thousands of miles or just hundreds of miles out into cold conditions in Cape Horn, or you're going up the Patagonian fjords, being outside on the monohull and feeling the sailing, which we absolutely love to do, can get old. You can become very cold, even hypothermic, and you have to be very cautious about sailing in a boat like the Sweet Ruka in reality, the comfort level of the floating caravan, as the commenter said, is actually a benefit in reality.
Yeah.
It does take away from that feeling of sailing, but there's times when you're long distance cruising or offshore sailing that, that feeling of sailing can get old after a while.
Yeah. All right.
All right.
Next myth.
Okay. You want to start this one off?
Myth number 6. Myth number 6. Catamarans don't sail well when loaded down for cruising. What do you
should
think?
say that with authority.
Okay. All right. Some people say myth number 6 is that catamarans do not sail well when loaded down for cruising. But what do you think, Curtis?
Well, I'd have to say that all boats are weight sensitive. A monohull is weight sensitive, as is a catamaran. Is a catamaran more so weight sensitive? I'm not exactly sure. Artemis was very fully loaded for cruising. Both of us went around Cape Horn with full fuel tanks, full water tanks, and full food and provisions for long distance cruising. So we had all the safety gear, all the stuff. Both boats were weighed down equally, and I think both boats performed pretty close to the same.
Yeah.
Now, there's definitely light ship racing mode that we could put Sweet Ruka in and ditch all kinds of weight, or the same thing could be done on a catamaran. So does the weight affect the catamaran? I don't think that there was such a huge issue with its effect on the catamaran's performance to have all of the cruising gear and the cruising comforts. Now, if we were racing, that would be a totally different story, but of course that's not what we're talking about here.
It didn't, seem to affect our ability to sail around Cape Horn.
Yeah, I think you can have a couple of extra refrigerators and have some excellent cuisine while cruising on your catamaran and not worry about it. Now, I guess once again, if you want that feeling of sailing, maybe you need to ditch all of that stuff. But we're talking about, in my opinion, different boats. You're hedging much further over to a racing boat by removing all of those things, and your comfort level as a cruiser goes way down.
One other thing I'll mention is that Artemis, as well as us, I believe, we both do consider the weight from side to side on the boat. We do try to keep it balanced. So regardless of how much weight that you are choosing to put on, it's still a good idea to have a balance from side to side.
And fore and aft.
And
so
fore and aft,
we
yes.
consider the fore and aft weight placement actually even sometimes more important than just the side to side, because that does affect things like hobby horsing that you were talking about earlier. Okay, last but certainly not least is the myth that catamarans are less safe offshore in heavy weather than monohulls.
Ooh, what do you think, Curtis?
Well, I think that you can't just focus on a boat solely in heavy weather. You have to look at the boat for ocean crossing all the way around. And all boats are going to have their trade-offs. For us, when we sailed around Cape Horn on Sweet Ruka, we didn't feel unsafe. And when we sailed around Cape Horn on Artemis, I don't think that I felt unsafe at any point in time. Did you?
No. And I'm not sure we saw quite the wind gusts that we did on Sweet Ruka when we were sailing on Artemis, but still there was some big wind. There was definitely some big waves, and I felt right at home.
Yeah, I'm fairly confident that a well-built performance cruising catamaran is going to handle similar conditions just as well as a performance cruising monohull. There may be some extreme level that
in typical sailing conditions, one boat didn't feel safer than the other.
Yeah, we weren't worried about flipping or anything like that. Now, I do want to mention one consideration, though, that is true about catamarans and monohulls, and a big difference is most of the time, a performance cruising catamaran, if it takes on water and is holed, is going to maintain kind of a neutral buoyancy, or even if it flips, it's still going to float. So a catamaran itself can become its own life raft, at least for, a lighter weight performance cruising catamaran. Now, the difference in us, like you could see, like back when we hit something with our rudder and we almost hold the boat, that was a very, very dangerous situation where we actually could have sunk. So, not having, 9,000 pounds of lead underneath our feet, actually, while sailing on Artemis, actually is kind of a thing that makes you feel good a little bit.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess I don't think there's a safety issue though, really with either boat in most normal cruising conditions.
There's so much more we could say about safety. There's so many different topics we could talk about for monohulls and for catamarans. That could be a video on its own, an episode completely set aside for itself, but that is in general our experience while sailing on Artemis around Cape Horn.
Yeah.
If you have any specific questions about safety or any of the other myths, leave them down below.
But all in all, we think that myth is completely busted, that monohulls are safer offshore in storms than a catamaran. I don't think it has any basis.
Yeah, if you prepare your boat well and you know how to work it in various conditions, big waves, big wind like Cape Horn, you'll be just fine.
Yeah. Okay, let's go sailing.
All right, guys, we're gonna get back into sailing Sweet Ruka, and some awesome changes coming up as we head into the fjords.
Yeah, we've got to tell you what's coming up next here. So for us on Sweet Ruka, our next goal is to sail the challenging route upwind and up current from Puerto Williams to Puerto Montt. It's about 1,200 miles of very difficult sailing up the fjords of Patagonia, and we expect to see some really amazing sights that we're going to bring you. We expect to see ice, mountains, glaciers, whales, wildlife, all kinds of stuff.
And all types of different sailing conditions, really. It's not the trade winds anymore, so every day is a new surprise. And yeah, I can't wait to get going.
Yeah, lots of hardcore upwind sailing to come.
Yeah. All right. Well, this has been Sweet Ruka on 7 Myths About Sailing a Catamaran. We'll see you next time. Ciao!